The morning fog clung to the grounds of Clarence House like a shroud, mirroring the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the royal household since the Queen's passing 6 months ago. Detective Inspector James Morrison adjusted his collar against the October chill as he approached the imposing Georgian facade. At 42, James had seen his share of sensitive investigations, but nothing quite like this. The call had come at dawn. A break-in at Clarence House, specifically targeting Queen Camilla's private quarters. What should have been a routine security breach investigation was about to become something far more complex and emotionally devastating. James was greeted at the entrance by Chief Inspector Helen Crawford, a woman whose stern expression had been etched deeper by recent events. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes held the weariness of someone who had been managing royal security for over 2 decades. "Inspector Morrison," she nodded curtly. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We have a delicate situation." As they walked through the ornate hallways lined with portraits of generations past, Helen briefed him on the initial details. The break-in had been discovered by the morning staff around 6 a.m. The intruder had somehow bypassed the outer security systems, but had triggered the motion sensors in Camilla's private study. "Here's where it gets interesting," Helen said, pausing outside an elegant mahogany door. "Nothing appears to be stolen. In fact, it looks like the intruder was interrupted while trying to open a concealed safe." James examined the study with the methodical eye of an experienced investigator. The room was a testament to refined taste. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held leather-bound volumes that spoke of both intellectual curiosity and inherited wealth. An antique writing desk sat positioned to catch the morning light from tall windows overlooking manicured gardens. What caught his attention immediately was the painting hanging askew on the far wall. Behind it, a small digital safe was visible, its doors slightly ajar with what appeared to be pry marks around the lock mechanism. The intruder was skilled, James observed, running his finger along the scratched metal. "These aren't amateur tool marks. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for." Helen's expression grew more troubled. "That's what concerns us. This safe isn't common knowledge, even among the household staff. Very few people would know of its existence." As James continued his examination, a soft knock interrupted them. A young woman in her early 30s entered, her red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands immediately drawing his attention. She wore the crisp uniform of palace staff, but her usual composure was clearly shattered. "This is Sarah Mitchell," Helen explained. "She's been Her Majesty's personal secretary for the past 8 years. Sarah, please tell the inspector what you told me." Sarah took a shaky breath before speaking. "I arrived early this morning to prepare Her Majesty's correspondence. When I entered the study, I found the safe open and—" Her voice broke slightly, and some items scattered on the floor. James noticed her reluctance to elaborate. "What kind of items, Miss Mitchell?" "Jewelry," she whispered, as if speaking louder might make the reality more concrete. "Pieces I'd never seen before. Very old, very valuable looking. And there was a letter." The mention of a letter made both James and Helen exchange glances. "Where is this letter now?" James asked gently. Sarah looked toward Helen, who nodded encouragingly. I put everything back in a safe. I thought I should wait for someone in authority. But, Inspector, the letter—" She paused, struggling with some internal conflict. "It was addressed to Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth. The handwriting looked old, and the paper was yellowed with age." James felt his pulse quicken. In his experience, old letters and secret safes rarely contained pleasant family recipes or holiday greetings. "Miss Mitchell, I need to see everything that was in that safe. This is no longer just a break-in investigation." As Sarah opened the safe with trembling fingers, James prepared himself for whatever revelation awaited. The safe, though small, contained more than he had expected. Wrapped in aged velvet cloth were several pieces of jewelry that even as untrained I could recognize as extraordinarily valuable. A diamond tiara caught the light like captured starfire, while emerald earrings seemed to hold secrets in their green depths. But it was the letter that commanded his attention. The envelope, indeed yellowed with age, bore the royal seal and was addressed in elegant script to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, with no return address. The postmark was from 1977, nearly 50 years ago. "Has anyone read this?" James asked, holding the envelope with the respect due to potentially explosive evidence. Both women shook their heads. "I wouldn't dare," Sarah said. "But Inspector, there's something else you should know. These jewelry pieces, some of them match descriptions I've seen in the palace inventory records. The implications hit James like a physical blow. If these pieces were from the official royal collection, their presence in a secret safe raised questions that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy's reputation. Helen's face had gone pale. Inspector, if what you're suggesting is true, I'm not suggesting anything yet. James cut her off firmly. But we need to handle this with extreme care. Miss Mitchell, I need you to compile a complete list of everyone who had access to this room and knowledge of this safe. Chief Inspector Crawford, we need to contact the keeper of the royal collection immediately. As the morning progressed, the investigation took on an increasingly surreal quality. The keeper of the royal collection, Dr. Margaret Thornfield, arrived within the hour. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to preserving royal heritage. Dr. Thornfield's examination of the jewelry pieces was conducted with scientific precision. She photographed each item from multiple angles, consulted reference materials on her tablet, and made careful notes in a leather-bound journal. Her expression grew increasingly grave with each piece she examined. Inspector Morrison, she finally said, setting down a particularly ornate necklace with obvious reluctance. I'm afraid your suspicions are correct. These pieces are definitely from the royal collection. This necklace alone is worth several £1,000,000. It was a wedding gift to Queen Victoria and has been missing from our official inventory for decades. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. James found himself staring at objects that represented not just immense monetary value, but centuries of royal history. The idea that they had been hidden away in a secret safe raised questions that no one in the room wanted to voice. Dr. Thornfield, James said carefully, when were these pieces first noted as missing? She consulted her notes with obvious discomfort. The records are somewhat unclear, which is unusual for our inventory system. Some pieces were last officially documented in the 1960s, others in the 1970s. What's particularly troubling is that there's no record of them being moved or loaned out. Helen had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. Dr. Thornfield, could these pieces have been legitimately removed from the collection? Perhaps as personal gifts or family inheritance? The keeper's expression suggested she had been hoping someone would ask this question. It's possible, though highly irregular. The documentation for such transfers would typically be extensive and would require approval from the monarch herself. But she hesitated. But what? James prompted. But there have been rumors over the years. Nothing substantiated, you understand, but whispers among the staff about certain pieces that seemed to disappear during times of transition or change in the household. Sarah had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this conversation. Finally, she couldn't contain herself any longer. There's something else, she burst out. Her Majesty Camilla has been acting strangely lately. She's been spending hours in this study, often late at night. Sometimes I would find her here in the morning, as if she had been there all night. And she's been asking me odd questions about the Queen's personal effects and what happened to them after the funeral. This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. James found himself wondering whether Camilla's recent behavior was connected to whatever was hidden in that safe, or whether she too had been investigating something that disturbed her. Miss Mitchell, James said gently, did Her Majesty ever mention finding anything unusual among the late Queen's personal effects? Any documents or items that seemed out of place? Sarah's face crumpled with the effort of maintaining professional discretion while wanting to unburden herself of troubling knowledge. She did mention finding some papers that didn't seem to belong with the official documents. She said they were personal correspondence that raised questions about family matters. The afternoon brought Dr. Thornfield's preliminary assessment, and it was more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Of the dozen pieces found in the safe, 8 were confirmed as missing items from the royal collection. Their total value exceeded £15 million, but their historical and cultural significance was incalculable. More troubling was the pattern that was emerging. All the missing pieces had been part of the collection during the late Queen Elizabeth's reign, and all had disappeared during periods when access to the royal residences was limited to immediate family members and the most trusted staff. James stared out the window at the gathering dusk, his mind wrestling with implications that seemed to grow more serious by the hour. In his hands was a letter that might contain answers, but also might shatter the carefully maintained image of a monarchy that prided itself on duty, honor, and integrity. The letter remained unopened, but its presence seemed to cast a shadow over everything else. Whatever secrets it contained had been hidden for nearly 50 years. The question now was whether those secrets were worth preserving or whether the truth, however painful, needed to finally come to light. As the investigation team prepared to secure the scene for the night, James found himself thinking about the human cost of whatever they were uncovering. Behind the priceless jewelry and mysterious letters were real people who had lived with secrets that were apparently devastating enough to hide for decades. The break-in, he was becoming convinced, hadn't been a random crime. Someone had known about the safe and its contents. Someone who felt that whatever was hidden there needed to be brought to light, regardless of the consequences. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more revelations, and quite possibly more heartbreak. But tonight, James Morrison went home knowing that his life had been forever changed by a glimpse into the carefully guarded secrets of the royal family. The fog was lifting as he drove through the gates of Clarence House, but the mystery was only deepening. Somewhere in the elegant rooms behind him lay the truth about missing jewelry, hidden letters, and a family whose public image might be built on foundations that were far more fragile than anyone had ever imagined. The weight of duty that had brought him to this investigation was nothing compared to the weight of the secrets he was beginning to uncover. And he had the disturbing feeling that this was only the beginning. Detective Inspector James Morrison arrived at Clarence House the next morning with a sense of foreboding that had kept him awake most of the night. The October sky was overcast, matching his mood as he contemplated the sealed letter that awaited examination. Chief Inspector Helen Crawford met him at the entrance, her face bearing the strain of a sleepless night spent considering the implications of their discovery. "The palace has sent Sir Richard Hartwell," she informed him as they walked toward the study. "He's been the family's legal counsel for 30 years. They want him present when we open the letter." Sir Richard proved to be a man in his late 60s with distinguished silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested a lifetime spent handling delicate matters for powerful people. His handshake was firm, but James noticed the slight tremor in his fingers that betrayed his nervousness about what they might uncover. "Inspector Morrison," Sir Richard said in a cultured voice that carried just a hint of Oxford education, "I trust you understand the sensitivity of this situation. Whatever we discover today must be handled with the utmost discretion." James nodded, though privately he wondered if discretion would be possible if the letter contained what he was beginning to suspect it might. Dr. Thornfield had arrived early and was already photographing the jewelry pieces with scientific precision, creating a permanent record before they potentially became evidence in a much larger investigation. The letter lay on the mahogany desk, like an unexploded bomb. Its aged paper and faded ink suggested it had been written decades ago, but the royal seal indicated it contained official correspondence of some kind. James had handled many pieces of evidence in his career, but none that felt quite so heavy with potential consequences. "Before we proceed," Sir Richard said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I want to stress that this correspondence may be protected by various legal privileges. The family has a right to privacy, even in death." "With respect, Sir Richard," James replied firmly, "we're investigating what may be theft from the royal collection. If this letter provides evidence relevant to that investigation, privilege may not apply." The tension in the room was palpable as James carefully opened the envelope. The letter inside was written on personal stationery bearing Queen Elizabeth's monogram, but the handwriting was different from her familiar script. The date at the top was September 15th, 1977, and the letter was signed Margaret. James read aloud, his voice growing quieter as the implications of each sentence became clear. "My dearest Elizabeth, I write to you with a heavy heart about a matter that has been troubling me for months. During my recent visits to Balmoral, I couldn't help but notice certain discrepancies in the inventory records for some of your most precious pieces. The emerald parure that belonged to your grandmother seems to be missing from its usual display case, as well as several other historically significant items. I would not presume to question your judgment, but as your sister, I feel I must express my concern. These pieces represent not just monetary value, but the heritage of our family and our nation. If they have been moved for security reasons, I understand completely. But if there is another explanation, the letter continued for several paragraphs, becoming increasingly specific about missing items and suggesting that the writer had conducted her own investigation. Most shocking was the final paragraph. I have reason to believe that these disappearances may not be isolated incidents. There are whispers among the staff about items being quietly removed, always during periods when documentation might be overlooked. My dear sister, I fear someone very close to us may be taking advantage of their position and your trust. I cannot bear to think of our family's legacy being diminished by betrayal from within. The silence that followed was deafening. James set the letter down with hands that weren't quite steady, while Sir Richard had gone noticeably pale. Dr. Thornfield stopped her photography work and stared at the letter as if it might contain additional revelations. Princess Margaret, Helen said quietly. She suspected theft from the royal collection in 1977 and apparently never received a satisfactory response. James added, noting the formal tone of the letter that suggested this wasn't the first time the subject had been raised. The question is, what happened after this letter was written? Sir Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. Inspector, you must understand that family relationships within the royal household are complex. Princess Margaret and Queen Elizabeth didn't always see eye to eye on various matters. This letter might represent nothing more than sibling concern that was later resolved privately. But James was already seeing connections that troubled him deeply. Dr. Thornfield, when you examined the inventory records yesterday, did you notice any changes or updates around 1977? She consulted her notes with obvious reluctance. Now that you mention it, yes. There was a major reorganization of the collection records in late 1977 and early 1978. Many items were reclassified or moved to different categories. At the time, it was explained as a modernization of the inventory system. How convenient, James muttered then, louder. What kind of reclassification? Some pieces were moved from royal collection to personal property of the monarch. Others were listed as on long-term loan without specifying to whom. A few were marked as undergoing conservation and then seemed to have disappeared from the records entirely. The picture that was emerging was deeply disturbing. If Princess Margaret's suspicions were correct, someone with intimate access to the royal collection had been systematically removing valuable pieces, possibly for decades. The reclassification of inventory records would have been an effective way to cover such thefts, making missing items seem like routine administrative changes rather than crimes. Sir Richard, James said carefully, I need to ask about the family's response to Princess Margaret's concerns. Were any investigations conducted? Any security reviews? The lawyer's discomfort was obvious. Inspector, I wasn't involved in the family's private correspondence during that period. However, I can tell you that Princess Margaret's relationship with certain members of the household staff was strained during those years. Her accusations weren't always well received. Helen had been studying the letter more closely. James, look at this postmark. The letter was sent from Mustique, where Princess Margaret had her holiday home. But there's something odd about it. She pointed to a small notation on the envelope that James had initially missed. In different ink and handwriting was a barely visible note. Personal, hold for private discussion, RH. RH, James mused. Those are your initials, Sir Richard. The lawyer's face reddened slightly. Yes, I did work for the family in various capacities during that period. But I don't recall this specific letter. But you do recall handling Princess Margaret's correspondence. Only in the most general sense. My role was primarily legal advice, not personal correspondence management. James wasn't convinced. The notation suggested that this letter had been intercepted or at least delayed before reaching its intended recipient. If Sir Richard had been involved in managing sensitive family communications, he might know more about the resolution of Margaret's concerns than he was admitting. Sarah Mitchell had been quietly observing the proceedings, but now she spoke up hesitantly. Inspector, there's something else about Her Majesty's recent behavior that might be relevant. All eyes turned to her. Please go on, Miss Mitchell. She's been making inquiries about Princess Margaret's personal papers. Specifically, she wanted to know if any of Margaret's correspondence with Queen Elizabeth had been preserved among the Queen's personal effects. She seemed particularly interested in letters from the 1970s. This revelation added another dimension to the mystery. If Camilla had somehow discovered Princess Margaret's concerns about missing jewelry, it might explain her recent preoccupation with the safe and its contents. Perhaps she had been conducting her own investigation into decades-old suspicions. Miss Mitchell, James continued, did Her Majesty mention what prompted these inquiries? Sarah glanced nervously at Sir Richard before answering. She said she found some references in Queen Elizabeth's personal papers that suggested unresolved family matters. She mentioned something about promises made to Margaret that were never kept. The emotional weight of this revelation settled over everyone in the room. If Queen Elizabeth had received her sister's letter and promised to investigate, but then failed to follow through, it represented not just a failure of security, but a betrayal of family trust that had been hidden for decades. Dr. Thornfield had returned to her examination of the jewelry, but now with a different purpose. Inspector, if we're looking at systematic theft going back to the 1970s, these pieces represent only a fraction of what might have been taken. The items mentioned in Princess Margaret's letter would be worth tens of millions in today's market. And where might such items end up? James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Private collections, overseas sales, or, she hesitated, they might be broken down and the individual gems sold separately. Once that happens, they become virtually untraceable. The investigation was expanding beyond anything James had initially imagined. What had started as a simple break-in was now revealing a pattern of theft that might have been ongoing for decades, involving people at the highest levels of the royal household. Sir Richard seemed to reach some internal decision. Inspector Morrison, I think it's time I shared some additional information. But I must insist on absolute confidentiality. That will depend on what you tell me, Sir Richard. The lawyer stood and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens as if seeking strength from the familiar view. In 1978, there was indeed an internal investigation into inventory discrepancies. It was conducted very quietly, with only a handful of people involved. The findings were troubling. What kind of findings? Evidence that someone with intimate knowledge of the collection's security procedures had been systematically removing pieces over several years. The investigation identified a pattern of thefts that coincided with specific periods when certain staff members had access. James felt his pulse quicken. Was anyone prosecuted? No. Sir Richard's voice was heavy with old regrets. The decision was made at the highest levels that prosecution would create a scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation. Instead, certain staff members were quietly dismissed, and new security procedures were implemented. But the stolen items were never recovered. Some were. Others. He shrugged helplessly. By the time the thefts were discovered, many pieces had already been sold or disposed of. The investigation estimated that items worth over £20 million had been stolen over a period of approximately 8 years. The magnitude of this revelation was staggering. James found himself staring at the jewelry pieces on the desk, wondering if they represented the tip of an iceberg that was far larger and more damaging than anyone had imagined. Sir Richard, Helen said quietly, if this investigation was conducted in 1978, why are these specific pieces still here? Why weren't they recovered along with the others? The lawyer's discomfort was obvious. That's where the situation becomes even more complex. These particular pieces weren't part of the original theft. According to our investigation, they were legitimately removed from the collection. By whom? By someone who had the authority to do so, but who may not have had the right to retain them permanently. James felt like pieces of a complex puzzle were finally beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was more troubling than he had expected. Sir Richard, are you suggesting that someone authorized to move these pieces later kept them when they should have been returned? I'm suggesting that the line between official duties and personal gain may have become blurred in certain cases. The implications were enormous. If someone in a position of trust had used their authority to legitimately remove valuable pieces from the collection, but then failed to return them, it represented not just theft, but a profound abuse of the trust placed in them by the royal family and the nation. As the afternoon wore on, the investigation team worked to catalog and photograph every item found in the safe. Each piece told its own story of artistry and history, but now they also told a darker story of betrayal and cover-up that had been hidden for decades. James found himself wondering about Queen Elizabeth's response to her sister's letter. Had she conducted the promised investigation? Had she discovered the truth about the missing pieces? And if so, why had justice never been served? The answers to these questions lay somewhere in the vast archives of royal correspondence and official records, but James suspected that finding them would require navigating a labyrinth of family secrets and institutional protections that had been carefully constructed over decades. As evening approached, he stood in the study where so many secrets had been revealed, watching the shadows lengthen across the Persian rug. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more revelations, and quite possibly more heartbreak for a family that had built its reputation on duty, honor, and service to the nation. The weight of Princess Margaret's letter in his hand was nothing compared to the weight of the secrets it had revealed, and he had the growing certainty that the most difficult revelations were still to come. The third day of the investigation dawned with an unexpected development that would change everything. Detective Inspector James Morrison was reviewing case files in his office when Chief Inspector Helen Crawford burst through his door, her face flushed with the excitement of someone who had made a breakthrough discovery. "James, you need to see this immediately," she said, setting down a thick folder on his desk. "We received a call this morning from an antiques dealer in Bath. Someone tried to sell him a piece of royal jewelry yesterday." James opened the folder to find photographs of an ornate diamond bracelet that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the pieces they had found in Camilla's safe. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and even in the dealer's amateur photographs, the quality of the diamonds was evident. "The dealer, Marcus Whitmore, has been in business for 30 years, Helen continued. "He specializes in estate jewelry and has developed contacts throughout the international market. When someone walked into his shop with this piece, he immediately recognized it as being of royal quality." "Did he make the purchase?" "No, and that's what makes this interesting. According to Whitmore, the seller was nervous, couldn't provide adequate provenance documentation, and seemed surprised when he started asking detailed questions about the piece's history. The seller claimed it was a family inheritance, but couldn't explain how their family had come to own something so obviously valuable." James studied the photographs more closely. The bracelet was definitely consistent with the other pieces they had discovered, both in terms of craftsmanship and historical period. Did Whitmore get a good look at the seller? Better than that. He has security cameras throughout his shop. We have clear footage of the entire transaction. The drive to Bath took them through the English countryside, which was displaying its autumn colors in magnificent array. Under different circumstances, James might have appreciated the beauty of the landscape, but his mind was focused entirely on the implications of this new development. If someone was actively trying to sell royal jewelry, it suggested that the break-in at Clarence House might not have been an isolated incident. Perhaps the thief had been part of a larger operation that had been ongoing for years, quietly disposing of stolen royal treasures through legitimate dealers who asked too few questions. Marcus Whitmore's antique shop occupied a narrow building on a cobblestone street in the heart of Bath's historic district. The windows displayed an eclectic collection of jewelry, silver, and decorative objects that spoke to the owner's discerning eye and established clientele. Whitmore himself proved to be a man in his late 50s with the kind of expertise that came from decades of handling valuable objects. His examination of the dealer's security footage revealed details that even his trained eye had missed during the original encounter. "Here," he said, pointing to the screen where a figure in a dark coat was visible entering the shop. "You can see how the seller keeps looking over their shoulder, as if afraid of being followed. And watch their hands, they're shaking when they unwrap the bracelet." The seller appeared to be a woman in her 40s or early 50s, though the camera angle and her careful positioning made it difficult to get a clear view of her face. She wore expensive clothing and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with valuable objects, but her nervous behavior suggested she was operating outside her comfort zone. "What exactly did she say about the bracelet's history?" James asked. Whitmore consulted his notes. She claimed it had belonged to her grandmother, who had worked as a lady's maid for a wealthy family in the early 20th century. According to her story, the bracelet had been a gift from her employer in recognition of long and faithful service. It was a plausible story, the kind of provenance that might explain how a piece of fine jewelry could end up in private hands. But James had learned to be suspicious of convenient explanations, especially when they involved valuable objects with questionable histories. "Mr. Whitmore, in your professional opinion, what would this bracelet be worth?" The dealer considered the question carefully. "If it's genuine, and I believe it is, I would estimate its value at somewhere between £2 and £3 million. The diamonds are of exceptional quality, and the setting represents the finest craftsmanship of its era." The figure was staggering, but it aligned with what Dr. Thornfield had told them about the value of the pieces found in Camilla's safe. If someone was systematically disposing of royal jewelry through antique dealers, they were talking about thefts worth tens of millions of pounds over potentially decades. Did the seller mention anything about having other pieces to sell? That's what really caught my attention, Whitmore said, his expression growing more serious. Before she left, she asked if I would be interested in viewing additional pieces from the same collection. She seemed to have the impression that I would simply accept her story and arrange for private sales without extensive documentation. This suggested that the seller was either naive about the legitimate antique trade or had been successful in selling to less scrupulous dealers in the past. James made a mental note to contact antique dealers throughout England to inquire about similar transactions. The return journey to London was spent in contemplative silence, both investigators processing the implications of what they had learned. The case was expanding beyond their initial investigation into a complex web of theft, deception, and betrayal that seemed to have roots going back decades. Back at Clarence House, they found Sir Richard Hartwell waiting in the study with an expression that suggested he had news of his own to share. He had extraordinary access to the most valuable pieces and was responsible for their security and maintenance. Where is Mr. Sterling now? He died in 2003. But, Inspector, you should know that Sterling was investigated internally on several occasions during his tenure. There were always suspicions about his management of certain high-value items. James felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. But he was never prosecuted. The evidence was always circumstantial. And Sterling had powerful allies within the royal household who vouched for his integrity and dedication to his duties. The investigation was revealing a pattern of institutional protection that had allowed potentially massive crimes to continue for decades. If Robert Sterling had been systematically stealing from the royal collection while filing fraudulent insurance claims, he had been operating with a level of protection that suggested complicity from others within the system. Sir Richard, James said carefully, I need to know who Sterling's allies were. Which members of the royal household supported him despite the suspicions? The lawyer's reluctance was obvious. Inspector, you're asking me to make accusations against people who dedicated their lives to serving the crown. These are individuals whose reputations and families could be destroyed by unfounded speculation. But we're not talking about speculation anymore, are we? We have evidence of stolen jewelry, fraudulent insurance claims, and a pattern of protection that allowed crimes to continue for decades. As the afternoon progressed, more evidence emerged from the archives. Dr. Thornfield discovered inventory discrepancies that aligned perfectly with the insurance claims, while Helen found security reports that had documented suspicious activity but had apparently never been properly investigated. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. It appeared that a network of individuals within the royal household had been systematically looting the collection while using their positions of trust to cover their tracks. The insurance fraud had provided a way to generate additional income from their crimes, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate losses. Most troubling was the realization that some of the stolen pieces might have remained within the royal household, hidden in private safes and personal collections where they could be gradually disposed of over time. The pieces found in Camilla's safe might represent only a small fraction of what had been stolen. Inspector, Sarah Mitchell said quietly, having observed the proceedings throughout the afternoon, there's something else I need to tell you about Her Majesty's recent behavior. James turned to give her his full attention. Please go on. She's been receiving phone calls. Late at night, when she thinks no one is around to overhear. I've heard her side of the conversations, and they seem to be about arranging meetings with people who claim to have information about missing items. The implications were chilling. If Camilla was being contacted by people claiming to have information about stolen royal jewelry, she might be walking into a dangerous situation. The individuals involved in decades of theft and fraud would have powerful motives to prevent their crimes from being exposed. Miss Mitchell, did Her Majesty mention any specific names or locations for these meetings? She mentioned a place called Millfield Manor, somewhere in the Cotswolds, and she seemed particularly interested in speaking with someone called Mrs. Patterson, though I don't know who that might be. James and Helen exchanged glances. If Camilla was planning to meet with unknown individuals who claimed to have information about the stolen jewelry, she could be putting herself in serious danger. The people behind decades of theft and fraud would not hesitate to take extreme measures to protect themselves. Sir Richard, James said urgently, "We need to contact Her Majesty immediately. If she's planning to meet with these people alone, she could be walking into a trap." The lawyer pulled out his phone with obvious reluctance. "Inspector, you must understand that approaching Her Majesty with these accusations will have consequences that go far beyond this investigation. Once we make contact, there will be no going back." "There's already no going back," James replied firmly. "We have evidence of crimes that may have cost the nation tens of millions of pounds and betrayed the trust of generations of royal family members. Her Majesty deserves to know the truth, and she needs to be protected from people who might harm her to keep that truth hidden." As evening approached, the investigation team prepared for what might be the most crucial phase of their work. The evidence they had gathered painted a picture of corruption and betrayal that went to the very heart of the institution they were trying to protect. But James knew that the most dangerous part of their investigation was yet to come. If Camilla was indeed planning to meet with the people behind these crimes, they were running out of time to prevent what could be a tragic conclusion to decades of carefully hidden corruption. The weight of their discoveries pressed down on everyone in the room. They had uncovered crimes that had been perpetrated against one of the most revered institutions in the world, by people who had been trusted with its most precious treasures. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that none of them wanted, but all of them knew was inevitable. The truth about the stolen royal jewels was finally coming to light, but James feared that the cost of that truth might be higher than any of them could have imagined. Detective Inspector James Morrison had barely slept, knowing that Queen Camilla had left Clarence House at dawn for what she believed was a private meeting about recovering stolen royal treasures. Despite their urgent attempts to contact her the previous evening, she had been unreachable, having apparently turned off her personal phone and dismissed her security detail for what she described as a personal matter requiring absolute discretion. The morning brought news that chilled James to the bone. Helen Crawford called at 6 a.m. with information from the surveillance team they had hastily assembled to monitor Camilla's movements. "She's at Millfield Manor," Helen reported, her voice tight with concern. "But, James, this isn't what we expected. The property belongs to Patricia Sterling, Robert Sterling's widow, and our background check reveals she's been living far beyond any conceivable legitimate income since her husband's death." James felt his blood run cold. If Patricia Sterling was the mysterious Mrs.